Rebecca Lane never imagined her life would turn out this way. At 52, she had spent over 3 decades pouring her heart into teaching preschoolers at a small community school in rural Texas. A widow and mother of 2, she was known in her church as a woman of unshakable faith. The kind who led the Sunday school, showed up early to clean the pews, and always had a warm hug ready for anyone in need. But behind her steady smile, Rebecca was struggling financially, emotionally, and spiritually. She had trusted God with everything: her finances, her health, her children. She tithed faithfully, prayed fervently, and never once missed a service. And yet, month after month, the numbers just wouldn't add up. Her paycheck barely covered rent, groceries, and gas, let alone the rising costs of medication and car repairs. Her old Dodge Caravan had over 200,000 miles on it and coughed like a dying animal every time she tried to start it. The air conditioner had long since quit, and during the Texas summer that felt like punishment. What stung even more was watching others around her, people who never once bowed their heads to pray, live comfortably. Some had newer cars, bigger homes, even took vacations to places like Florida or the Grand Canyon. Rebecca couldn't afford to take her grandkids to the movies. She often sat alone at night, a cup of decaf in hand, staring at a stack of overdue bills spread out across her kitchen table. She'd whisper through tears, "Lord, I don't need luxury. I just need enough." Her heart ached most when her grandkids, who she had custody of after her daughter's addiction relapse, asked for things she couldn't provide: a new pair of sneakers, a school field trip, or just a treat from Dairy Queen. Still, she clung to her faith. God will make a way, she'd tell herself, even as her bank account dipped below $20. But in her quiet moments, she began to feel forgotten. Was she being punished? Had she failed somehow? Why did doing everything right still leave her broke, exhausted, and holding back tears in the Walmart checkout line? And then on a blistering July afternoon, while organizing a playground cleanup at school, Rebecca collapsed. The thermometer had hit 103 degrees, and no one noticed she was missing until a janitor found her unconscious near the garden hose. The doctors later said it was a heat stroke, severe dehydration, dangerously high body temperature, and her heart had stopped for 9 full minutes. But what happened during those 9 minutes was not just a brush with death. It was a journey that would shake her to the core, open her eyes to a spiritual truth she'd never considered, and change the way she understood struggle, wealth, and God's love forever. Rebecca Lane felt her body collapse, but she didn't feel it hit the hot Texas dirt. One moment she was holding a rake, wiping sweat from her brow, and the next, there was only silence. No more heat. No more aching joints. No more worries about the bills waiting on her kitchen table. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt more real than anything she'd ever known. She hovered above her own body, watching the janitor sprint toward her, yelling for help. Paramedics arrived minutes later. Their radios crackled, hands moved fast. IVs were inserted. CPR began. Rebecca watched it all in eerie stillness, her body still lying motionless in the sun, while her spirit drifted in peace above. Then everything changed. The hospital sounds, the flashing lights, the earthly chaos, it all faded. A brilliant light appeared in the distance, so radiant it made the sun look like a dim bulb. But the light didn't blind her. It welcomed her. It was warm, alive, and carried a presence that pulled her in, not like a force, but like a home she hadn't realized she'd been missing all her life. As she moved closer, the burdens of earth peeled away. No more guilt, no more fear, no more shame about what she didn't have. For the first time in decades, Rebecca felt whole, and then she saw him. Jesus stood before her not as a man in sandals or a painting from her church's fellowship hall, but as radiant love itself. His light pulsed with power and peace. Yet when he looked at her, his eyes held something far greater than any sermon could describe. compassion, so deep, so personal. It made her weep without tears. "Rebecca," he said, his voice neither loud nor soft, but echoing in her very being. "You are not forgotten. You have been chosen." She gasped. Or at least she felt like she did. "Chosen for what?" "But I've struggled so much," she tried to say. "I tithed, I prayed, I served, and still I barely made it." Jesus stepped closer, and the space around them shimmered, shifting like water touched by wind. "What you saw as lack," he said gently, "was my hand shielding you." Suddenly, scenes from Rebecca's life began unfolding around them. Moments she had nearly forgotten, nights when she cried silently in her car, days when she gave her last $5 to someone in greater need. Jesus showed her unseen battles. She had been protected from deals she nearly entered that would have led her into debt relationships, that would have wounded her children, unexpected blessings that arrived at the exact right moment. She saw how her pain had purpose and her poverty had been a form of divine preservation. "You thought I was far," he said, "but I was closest during your struggle. You weren't being punished. You were being prepared." Rebecca trembled at the weight of those words. The struggle wasn't proof of God's absence. It was evidence of His mercy. In that moment, she didn't just feel seen. She felt chosen not for suffering, but for something greater. And Jesus wasn't finished showing her what that meant. Rebecca Lane stood in the radiant presence of Jesus, her spirit still trembling from the revelation He had just spoken. You weren't being punished. You were being prepared. Those words echoed through the glowing expanse surrounding them, resonating in her very soul, like a melody she hadn't realized she knew by heart. But as the light around her rippled, a new scene began to emerge, one that would answer the question that had haunted her for decades. Why do the ones who love God the most often suffer the deepest struggles? Jesus lifted His hand, and the brilliant space around them shifted like wind, moving across a wheat field in the Texas summer. Before her appeared what looked like a vast horizon, a living canvas of people, each one suspended in a different season of life. Rebecca saw families gathered around kitchen tables covered in overdue bills, single mothers weeping over empty refrigerators, pastors praying over dwindling church offerings, and elderly couples counting their coins at the pharmacy counter, deciding between medication and groceries. They were the faithful, the ones who had prayed in the dark, who had worshipped through tears, who had tithed their last $10 without knowing how they'd get through the week. But then the veil lifted. Suddenly Rebecca saw what no human eyes could ever see on their own. Above each struggling believer was a shield of shimmering light, a divine covering that pulsed like a heartbeat. Jesus looked at her and said, "What they see as lack, I have used as protection. For many, abundance too soon would have crushed their souls." As she watched, the vision zoomed in on one particular man, a middle-aged father who had begged God for a financial breakthrough. In one version of his life, that prayer was answered overnight. A sudden inheritance, a lottery win, a business deal gone wildly successful. At first he praised God with tears, but slowly, subtly, his heart shifted. Church became optional, prayer became rare. He started trusting in his bank account more than in the one who gave him breath. Eventually, he forgot to be thankful altogether. Rebecca's heart ached as she saw it play out. She had known men just like him, good, honest folks who had drifted from God the moment they didn't need Him anymore. Jesus showed her more a woman who had long begged for success in her online business. When it finally came, so did pride. She no longer needed to rely on God. Her mornings, once filled with quiet time and prayer, were now packed with sales calls, photo shoots, and influencer deals. She wasn't evil, just distracted, and in her distraction she drifted far from the one who had once been her anchor. Turning back to Rebecca, Jesus said, "So many of my children ask me for wealth, believing it will solve their pain. But they don't see what I see. They ask for blessing, but they are not ready for the burden that blessing brings. Rebecca felt a lump rise in her throat. All her life she had prayed for just a little more. She hadn't wanted millions, just enough to breathe without fear. But now she saw how even a small overflow, if received at the wrong time or for the wrong reason, could invite pride, disconnection, and even destruction. Jesus continued, "You were shielded not because you were weak, but because your heart was precious. You were being guarded like fine silver refined in the fire." At that moment, Rebecca realized her financial hardship hadn't been a curse. It had been a training ground. Her trust, forged through struggle, had become stronger than gold. She looked back at the scenes of others like her, those still praying, still weeping, still wondering if God had forgotten them, and she understood these weren't forgotten people. They were warriors in disguise, souls God was preparing for something greater than comfort, purpose. As Jesus reached out his hand once more, he said softly, "Come, Rebecca. There is more to see." As Rebecca stood in the presence of Jesus, still reeling from the truth that what she once saw as lack had actually been divine protection, the light around her shimmered again. It was not the blinding brilliance of glory this time, but something deeper, solemn, revealing. Jesus gently took her hand, and without speaking, they moved into a new vision. This time it wasn't individuals she saw, it was generations. Before her eyes unfolded a tapestry of families. It was as if time had unraveled and laid itself bare. She saw great-grandparents, humble and hard-working, passing down values of honesty, prayer, and resilience. But she also saw something else: chains. Not of iron or steel, but of unseen weight, worry, fear, and most of all, the heavy burden of poverty passed down like an inheritance. These weren't just financial struggles. They were spiritual cycles rooted in old patterns, worn into the soul. Jesus turned to her, his voice low but full of purpose. "Rebecca, many of my children are not only carrying their own burdens, but the burdens of generations before them. And they don't even realize it." She watched as a grandfather sat at his kitchen table in the 1950s, counting out coins to cover the rent, sighing heavily as he pushed off dreams he once held. Then his son grew up repeating that same script, working hard, praying faithfully, but never quite breaking through. His children then inherited more than his blue-collar work ethic. They inherited his anxiety, his mindset of never enough, and a deep-seated belief that maybe they just weren't meant to prosper. Rebecca's heart ached. She recognized the pattern. She had lived it. Her own father had worked 3 jobs and still couldn't get ahead. Her mother had been a coupon-clipping warrior, pinching every penny while hiding her tears at night. And now Rebecca, despite her faith and integrity, had carried that same silent grief. It had followed her like a shadow, whispering, "This is just how life is for people like you, how life." Jesus continued, "These are spiritual inheritances, chains that I never intended for my children to wear. But because they are unseen, they go unchallenged. You were not just chosen to endure, you were chosen to break the cycle." Rebecca turned toward the vision again, and this time she saw herself kneeling at her bedside, whispering prayers into the night, clutching bills and a Bible in the same trembling hands. Around her were the faint, fading chains of her ancestors, but in her hands, glowing with the same soft light she saw earlier, was a key. She didn't know how she had it, but it pulsed with purpose. Jesus placed his hand over hers. "This is authority," he said. "The power to shift what your bloodline has accepted for generations. The enemy has tried to convince you that struggle is your identity. But I say to you, it was only your training." Tears streamed down Rebecca's cheeks. She hadn't just been surviving her own story. She had been chosen to rewrite the future of her entire family. And not just her children, but her children's children. What she broke would stay broken for good. Jesus pointed, and the vision moved forward in time. She saw her grandchildren not wealthy in material things, but free. Free from shame, from fear, from that haunting mindset of never enough. They were generous, joyful, confident in God's provision. And it wasn't because life had been easy. It was because someone had finally stood up and said no more. Rebecca turned to Jesus, breathless. "Why me?" she asked. His eyes met hers, filled with both tenderness and power. "Because you didn't quit. Because you kept praying. Because you asked the questions others were too afraid to speak. Because I knew you would listen." The vision began to dim, but the revelation had burned into her spirit. She hadn't been cursed, she had been commissioned, and through her obedience a new inheritance was being written. Not one of lack, but of legacy. "Come," Jesus said, "there is more I must show you." As the vision of generational chains faded, Rebecca stood in silence, her soul still echoing with the weight of what she had just witnessed. The truth that she had not been abandoned but chosen to break spiritual cycles had stirred something deep within her, a holy fire, quiet but steady. She no longer saw her financial struggles as a curse, but as training for something greater. But just as she began to find peace in that revelation, Jesus turned to her once more. His expression was loving but firm. "There's still more I must show you," he said. With a wave of his hand, the vision shifted again. The peaceful atmosphere was replaced by something heavier, darker. Rebecca now stood above the earth, viewing homes, churches, and neighborhoods, but there was something slithering among them. Shadows, long, creeping, and sinister, moved through everyday life. They slipped under doors, curled around bank statements, clung to the corners of family dinners, and whispered in the ears of faithful believers. She could not hear the words, but she felt their power. Discouragement, doubt, frustration. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tight. Jesus spoke softly. "These are assignments, targeted attacks from the enemy. Not random, but strategic. Designed to shake the faith of my chosen ones." Rebecca's breath caught. She saw believers, ordinary, good-hearted people under siege. A single mother who had tithed every paycheck was now sitting in a mechanic's waiting room, crying silently as she learned her car would cost $1,200 to fix money she didn't have. A retired couple, faithful churchgoers, had just received a medical bill that drained their savings. A small-town pastor, already struggling to keep his ministry afloat, faced a sudden building repair he couldn't afford. These weren't just hard times. These were spiritual ambushes, and yet the people affected didn't see it that way. Some grew angry, blaming God. Others sank into quiet despair, feeling forgotten. Still others, with tears in their eyes, stopped praying altogether, thinking perhaps their faith just wasn't strong enough. Jesus' voice grew more intense. "The enemy knows who carries great callings. That is why he wages financial war, not to break their wallets, but to break their spirits." Rebecca watched as the darkness laughed, feeding off frustration and fear. And then she saw herself again from just weeks before, sitting at her kitchen table, hands folded over past due bills, whispering, "God, do you even see me?" She clutched her chest, heart aching. "I didn't know. I thought you were punishing me." Jesus turned to her, his gaze steady. "And that's exactly what the enemy wanted you to believe." Suddenly a new scene unfolded. This time the shadows crept toward a woman who had just lost her job. Instead of collapsing in fear, the woman fell to her knees in her living room and began to worship. Her voice cracked with emotion, but she sang, "Great is thy faithfulness." The shadows hissed, then recoiled. They backed away, unable to penetrate the light rising from her prayer. More scenes appeared, others who had chosen to stand firm in faith despite everything. A man walked the streets, handing out food from a half-empty pantry. A couple gave their last $50 to someone in greater need. A young pastor in a rundown church preached as though the building was full, even though only 6 people sat in the pews. With every act of faith, light pierced the darkness. Jesus nodded toward the faithful few, his voice full of hope. They are winning battles they cannot see. Their praise, their perseverance, their generosity. It shakes the very foundation of hell. Rebecca's eyes welled up. She finally understood. The enemy wasn't attacking her because she was weak. He was attacking her because she was dangerous. She had always seen her struggles as a sign of failure, but now she knew they were a sign of destiny. Jesus continued, "Many of my children pray for financial blessing, but they don't see that they are already in the middle of a spiritual war. The lack is not a sign of my absence, it is a battlefield, and what they do in the middle of that battle determines what kind of victory they will walk into." Rebecca looked down again. The believers who continued to worship, to give, to love despite their lack, they shone. They glowed like lanterns in a storm. The darkness hated them but could not touch them. Jesus turned to her once more. "Your obedience is your weapon. Your praise is your power. Your faith is your fire. And your breakthrough is already on the way." Rebecca nodded slowly, her heart burning with understanding. She was not cursed. She was not forgotten. She was on the front lines, and God Himself was fighting with her. As Rebecca stood in the warmth of that radiant place, Jesus' final words from the previous vision still echoed in her heart. "Your obedience is your weapon. Your praise is your power. Your faith is your fire." She had seen the hidden spiritual war behind financial struggles. She had watched faithful believers stand firm, pushing back shadows with nothing more than trust in God's promises. She finally understood that she hadn't been overlooked. She had been fortified. And yet, even as her spirit was lifted by these revelations, Jesus gently touched her shoulder again. "There is still one more thing you must see," He said. Rebecca nodded, ready, though her heart trembled. The light around them dimmed slightly, not in fear, but in reverence. The space shifted once again, and Rebecca found herself standing in front of a series of scenes that began to play out like chapters in a book. Only these were stories of real people, believers, people who had once walked in close communion with God. Rebecca recognized some of them. She had seen them in churches, in online ministries, on television interviews. They had once been prayer warriors, Bible teachers, worship leaders, men and women who had inspired thousands. And yet, as the vision unfolded, she began to see the slow unraveling of their hearts. One man, once a devoted Bible study teacher, had received the financial breakthrough he prayed for. His business grew faster than he ever imagined. At first, he praised God for every new contract, every dollar earned. But then the hours grew longer and the prayers grew shorter. Church became an afterthought. The scriptures that once guided his every decision were now collecting dust. He hadn't stopped believing, he had just stopped prioritizing. Another woman, once known for her generosity, had come into a large inheritance. It was a blessing, but it slowly became a prison. She stopped giving, stopped sharing. She lived in constant fear of losing what she had gained. Rebecca's heart broke as she watched. These were not evil people. They hadn't walked away from God in defiance, but in distraction. Wealth had quietly shifted their focus. Their faith had not been stolen. It had simply faded. Jesus looked at her with sorrow in his eyes. Many pray for more, but they do not understand what more requires. Abundance demands stewardship. It demands discipline. It demands a heart that stays anchored even when the winds of prosperity blow strong. Rebecca felt the truth of it like a weight in her chest. She thought back to all the times she had begged God to just give me enough. She now saw how easily her own heart could have followed the same path. How many people, she wondered, had been undone by the very blessings they thought would save them. Then the vision changed again. She now stood before a young pastor. His ministry had begun in a tiny building, hardly more than a shed. The pews were mismatched. The sound system barely worked, and the heater groaned every Sunday morning. And yet people came. They came because the Spirit moved. They came because they heard truth. Rebecca remembered visiting that church once years ago when she was traveling. It had felt like home. But now she saw the same pastor in a sleek megachurch. The lights were bright. The stage, massive. The pews had been replaced by stadium seating, and something else had changed too, the sermons. They were no longer filled with scripture but with slogans. Gone were the altar calls. In their place were TED Talk-style messages about motivation and success. The pastor still mentioned Jesus, but just barely. It wasn't heresy, but it wasn't holy either. Jesus' voice was gentle but unwavering. Even my shepherds are not immune. When wealth and influence arrive before humility is secure, pride sneaks in through the back door. Rebecca's knees weakened. She had no idea the stakes were so high. Then what do you want us to do? She asked, her voice cracking. Jesus turned toward her, and she felt his gaze pierce into her soul. I want my children to be faithful with little before I trust them with much. I want them to be rooted so deeply in me that no blessing, no matter how great, can pull them away. I want them to seek my face, not my hand. To crave my presence, not just my provision. She fell to her knees, sobbing without sound. Lord, I didn't know. I thought more would fix it all. He knelt beside her. That's what many believe. But what they truly need isn't more money. It's more of me. As his words wrapped around her, Rebecca understood that wealth was never the goal. It was a test, a tool, sometimes even a trap. And if given before a heart is ready, it becomes the very thing that pulls a soul from its purpose. The light that had once surrounded Rebecca began to dim, not with fear, but with finality. She could sense her time in the heavenly realm, drawing to a close. Yet Jesus stood beside her, unwavering as he had from the beginning. Her heart was full, overflowing with visions of truth lessons, etched into her soul like sacred carvings. She had seen the hidden mercy in financial lack, witnessed the spiritual warfare targeting the faithful, and felt the weight of prosperity given too soon. But now, standing at the edge of eternity, she realized something even deeper. Her journey wasn't just about her. It was about those who came before her, and those yet to come. Jesus raised his hand once more, and the vision changed. Rebecca now saw family after family stretching across time like a tapestry of generations, woven together by both love and struggle. She recognized some of the faces. Her own grandmother, who had canned vegetables from a backyard garden just to stretch every dollar. Her father, who had worked 14-hour days at a tire plant and still worried about the heating bill every winter. Rebecca watched her own past unfold, paying off student loans on a nurse's salary, pinching pennies to buy shoes for her kids, fixing leaky faucets herself to avoid repair costs. But this time she saw it all from a different angle. It wasn't just poverty. It was a pattern, a spiritual inheritance passed down like a hidden chain, one that bound each generation to fear, to lack, to the belief that just getting by was all they were allowed to expect. She turned to Jesus, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Why me?" she asked. "Why show me this?" "Because you are the link," he replied. "You are the one I've chosen to break the cycle." Rebecca's breath caught in her chest. All her life she had assumed her battles were personal, but now she saw them for what they were: generational strongholds that needed to be shattered. Not just for her sake, but for her children, and her children's children. She was holding a key, now glowing spiritual and unmistakable, and she realized she had a choice. She could pass down her struggles, or she could pass down freedom. The scene shifted again, and she saw two paths diverging. On one path, her descendants followed the same burdens she had faced: overdraft fees, late rent notices, never enough to rest or dream. But on the other path, she saw her grandchildren growing up with more than financial peace. They had spiritual peace. They were generous, grounded, wise. They knew how to steward, how to wait, how to worship, even in lean times. Not because money never ran short, but because fear never had the final word. Jesus looked into her eyes with infinite tenderness. "The breakthrough they are waiting for begins with you," he said. "When you choose to trust me, really trust me, not just in the gain, but in the waiting, the pruning, the stretching, you are not just changing your life. You are redeeming the whole bloodline." Rebecca's heart broke open. Suddenly, every unpaid bill, every empty pantry, every prayer whispered through tears took on new meaning. They weren't just moments of hardship. They were seeds. And now she had seen the harvest those seeds could produce if she stayed the course. As the vision began to fade, Jesus gave her one last command. "Tell them," he said, "not just about what you saw. Tell them what it means. Remind my children that I do not delay out of anger, but out of love. I do not withhold to punish, but to protect. And when the time is right, what I give will never become their God, because they will know me as their provider, not just their blessing." A wind began to stir, carrying her backward through the light. Rebecca cried out, wanting to stay, but she knew her time had come. She had been sent back not just with a testimony, but with a torch. And now it was up to her to light the way. The story of Rebecca offers a profound reminder that life's trials, especially financial struggles, can carry deeper meaning than what meets the eye. For many older adults who have weathered decades of hardship, this narrative reveals a hidden mercy in seasons of lack. Rebecca's near-death experience shows us that what we often interpret as punishment or delay may in fact be divine protection, shielding us from spiritual dangers we cannot yet see. It reframes struggle as preparation, not rejection. God, in his infinite wisdom, withholds not to harm, but to strengthen, to deepen trust, and to align us with eternal purpose. The lesson is not just about wealth or poverty. It's about stewardship, about breaking generational chains, and about living with the awareness that every choice echoes into the lives of those who come after us. For those in their golden years, it's a call to reflection, to see past regret, to reinterpret pain as refinement, and to recognize the legacy of faith we're still building. Rebecca's story encourages us to walk forward not in fear, but with the quiet strength that comes from knowing our struggle is not wasted, it's seen, it's shaping us, and it's leaving behind a trail of light for future generations.